Korean Mafia boss never met the black nurse before. So why was she carrying his child? Kendra Vaughn stepped into the obsidian and glass lobby of the Jean Group on a humid Tuesday morning, her vibrant emerald maternity dress a sharp defiance against the sterile, gray corporate surroundings. She moved with a calm authority that forced the security detail to hesitate, her chin tilted at an angle that signaled she wasn't there to ask for permission. At the marble reception desk, she didn't wait to be addressed. She slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the surface and looked the receptionist, Vanessa, directly in the eye. "Tell Marcus Jean that his future just walked through the front door," Kendra said, her voice a low, steady hum. Vanessa glanced at the prominent curve of Kendra's belly, then at the sealed wax on the envelope, and reached for the intercom without a second thought. Kendra took a seat in the high-backed leather chair of the waiting area. To the world, she looked untouchable. In reality, her feet were throbbing and a sharp pain was blossoming in her lower back. She hadn't slept, her mind replaying the medical records she'd uncovered at Dr. Wolf's clinic over and over. But as the elevator doors across the room chimed, she straightened her spine and folded her hands over Elijah. She had spent years as a neonatal nurse watching parents break. She would not be the one to flinch today. 60 floors up, Marcus Jean was in the middle of a billion-dollar negotiation with a London private equity firm. He was a man of absolute silence and absolute control. When Vanessa entered the boardroom unannounced, the investors fell silent, sensing the shift in the room's gravity. Marcus didn't look up until the envelope was placed on the polished mahogany in front of him. "She says it's personal, sir," Vanessa whispered. Marcus stared at his name, written in a bold, clinical hand he had never seen before. He excused himself from the call, the silence in his chest growing cold. He broke the seal and pulled out a single sheet of forensic lab results. At the top was his name, a man who had been told 10 years ago he would never have a legacy. At the bottom, in black and white, was the statistical impossibility he could no longer deny. Paternity probability, 99.9%. Let's take a pause. Kindly subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments section where you are listening from. Thank you. Now let's continue. Marcus Jean did not move. He stared at the DNA report for a full minute after the elevator doors closed, the silence of the lobby pressing in on him like the weight of a collapsing building. The 99.9% probability seemed to pulse in his vision, a red digital heartbeat that shouldn't exist. He had been a man defined by the absolute. Absolute power, absolute wealth, and the absolute certainty that his lineage ended with him. Now, that certainty was a pile of ash at his feet. He turned toward the high-backed leather chair where Kendra Vaughn sat. She didn't look like a fraud. She looked like a woman who had crossed a desert to deliver a message she knew would be hated. Marcus signaled to Victor Lang, his lead counsel, who had appeared silently at his shoulder. Victor's face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes were darting over the chain of custody stamps on the documents Kendra had provided. "The boardroom," Marcus said, his voice a jagged edge. "Now." 10 minutes later, the air in the private conference room was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive espresso. Victor had spread the files across the mahogany table, cross-referencing the sample numbers with Marcus's private medical history. "It's legitimate, Marcus," Victor whispered, the gravity of the statement making the billionaire's jaw tighten. "The signature on the archival release isn't yours, but the sample, it came from the Holloway vault. Specifically, the wing overseen by Dr. Adrian Wolf." At the mention of the name, Kendra, who had been stoically nursing a glass of water, felt a cold shiver trace her spine. "Wolf," she repeated, her voice steady but hollow. "I knew his name was on the header, but seeing it here, in this context, it makes the nightmare real." Marcus leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Tell me everything. No clinical summaries. I want the truth of how you ended up in his orbit." Kendra set the glass down, her hands folding protectively over her stomach. "I was a neonatal nurse at Holloway 3 years ago," she began, the memories surfacing like shards of glass. Wolf was a god there. He ran the Legacy Initiative, a program supposedly designed to study long-term genetic viability in high-performing subjects. I was young, idealistic, and struggling with my own health coverage. When the clinic offered a comprehensive wellness and fertility preservation package for staff, I didn't question it. I thought it was a perk. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline, her expression hardening. I went in for what was supposed to be a routine hormonal balancing procedure under sedation. Wolf handled it personally. He told me I was the perfect candidate for his research. I didn't realize until months later that the research wasn't a study. It was an implantation. By the time I felt the first signs of pregnancy and accessed my own encrypted file, I found his signature on a donor release form I never signed. And your name, Marcus, was listed as the primary biological source. Marcus felt a surge of cold, precise rage, the kind that usually preceded a massacre in the shipping ports. He had trusted Holloway with his most private data under the guise of medical advancement. Instead, Adrian Wolf had treated his DNA like a stolen commodity and Kendra's body like a laboratory. He didn't just want a child, Marcus said, the realization settling in his gut. He wanted a bridge. He created a biological link between the gene group and a stranger, a liability he could trigger whenever he needed to bring me to my knees. Victor Lang looked up from his tablet. Wolf is currently the director of the Wolf Institute for Genomic Excellence. He's untouchable, Marcus. He has half the state legislature on his donor list. Then we start at the source, Marcus replied, standing up and buttoning his charcoal blazer. The untouchable king was back, but the ice in his eyes was now fueled by a father's protective instinct he didn't know he possessed. Kendra, you know that facility better than any investigator I could hire. You're going to help me dismantle his den, brick by brick. The transition from the sterile conference room to the heights of Marcus's private world happened in a blur of armored SUVs and silent, high-speed elevators. By the time the doors slid open to the triplex penthouse, Kendra felt the sheer scale of Marcus's isolation. The space was a fortress of glass and brushed steel, perched so high above the city that the sirens and chaos of the streets were reduced to a distant, flickering hum. It was a place designed for a man who trusted no one, yet here she was, the one living variable he couldn't calculate, stepping onto his polished marble floors. Marcus didn't offer a tour. He simply gestured toward the western wing with a sharp, clinical movement of his hand. Vanessa has prepared the guest suite. It's been swept for listening devices and has its own ventilation system. You stay here until Wolf is neutralized. His voice remained a low, controlled vibration, but Kendra noticed the way his gaze lingered for a fraction of a second on her stomach before he turned away, his footsteps echoing through the hollow hall. In the days that followed, the penthouse became a theater of quiet transformation. Vanessa, who had served as Marcus's shadow for 7 years, was the first to witness the cracks in the obsidian. She began to find her boss not in the home office reviewing shipping manifests, but in the darkened library, lit only by the blue glow of a tablet. To anyone else, it looked like he was studying hostile takeover strategies. But Vanessa, coming in to deliver his midnight espresso, caught glimpses of the screen, developmental milestones at 24 weeks, nutritional requirements for third trimester fetal health, and the impact of paternal vocal recognition on newborns. The man who spoke in commands was now obsessively absorbing the vocabulary of a life he had been denied. He began to cross-reference Kendra's prenatal vitamin brands with medical journals, his legalistic mind treating fatherhood like a high-stakes litigation he had to win. He would never ask Kendra how she felt, but the refrigerator was suddenly stocked with the specific organic produce she had mentioned liking in a passing comment to the staff. Vanessa watched from the doorway one evening as Marcus stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights reflecting in his dark eyes. He was holding a small, silver rattle that had appeared on his desk that morning, a gift from an anonymous business associate who had heard the rumors. For a moment, his measured, cold exterior vanished. He didn't shake it, he simply gripped the cold metal until his knuckles turned white, a man terrified by the depth of a connection he hadn't yet learned how to name. The untouchable king was still there, but he was building a new kind of empire now, one where the walls weren't made of steel, but of the desperate, secret hope of a man who finally had something to lose. The peace of the penthouse was shattered 48 hours later by a notification that pulsed like a warning siren on Marcus's secure terminal. Richard Halston, a man who smelled weakness like a shark smells blood, had moved faster than anticipated. By the time Marcus reached the top-floor boardroom of the Gene Group, the air was already poisoned with the smug satisfaction of an enemy who believed he had finally found the killing blow. "Stability is the bedrock of this firm, Marcus," Halston began, leaning back in his chair with a predatory grin. He tossed a grainy, long-lens photograph onto the glass table, an image of Kendra Vaughn entering the building. "But here you are, bringing a pregnant stranger into your private residence in the middle of a billion-dollar merger. The rumors are already hitting the private equity circles. A scandalous pregnancy. A potential heir from a woman no one has ever heard of. It suggests you've lost the legendary control we all supposedly bank on." Marcus didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, his silhouette framed by the sprawling city behind him, his expression as unreadable as the obsidian walls. He knew exactly what Halston was doing. He was using the pregnancy to paint Marcus as unstable and compromised, a liability to be purged before the next board vote. The irony was a bitter weight in Marcus's chest. He had to defend his fitness to lead by dismissing the very child that was currently rewriting his entire biological identity. "My personal security arrangements are not a matter for board debate, Richard," Marcus replied, his voice a low, lethal vibration that made the junior members at the far end of the table visibly stiffen. "The woman in that photograph is a key witness in a multi-jurisdictional fraud investigation involving Holloway Medical. Her presence in my home is a matter of corporate intelligence, not personal indiscretion. If you had spent as much time vetting our medical partners as you do following my motorcade, you might have noticed the catastrophic breach in our archival security." He was dancing on a razor's edge. He couldn't reveal the truth, that the child was his, without giving Halston the legacy scandal he craved. But he couldn't deny her importance without leaving Kendra vulnerable. Halston narrowed his eyes, searching for a flicker of hesitation, but Marcus remained a statue of frozen resolve. "Witness or not, she's a distraction," Halston pushed, his voice rising. "The investors want a CEO, not a protector. If this scandal breaks, your chairmanship is over. The only scandal here, Richard, is your inability to focus on the merger," Marcus countered, leaning forward until he was inches from Halston's face. The predator suddenly realized he had stepped into a trap of his own making. "Now, sit down and review the forensic audit on Holloway, or I will have the security team escort you out of this building for gross negligence. We have an empire to run, and I suggest you start acting like you're a part of it." The storm that rolled over the city that evening was a literal manifestation of the turbulence defining Marcus's new life. Thunder shook the heavy glass walls of the penthouse, and lightning illuminated the stark, modern lines of the living room in jagged strobes. Inside the fortress, the atmospheric pressure seemed to snap when Kendra let out a sharp, ragged gasp, her hands gripping the edge of the granite kitchen island so hard her knuckles turned white. The sudden, rhythmic rush of water against the marble floor signaled the end of the waiting game. "Marcus," she breathed, her voice tight with the first wave of a contraction. "It's time." The man who had faced down hostile boards and underworld syndicates without blinking moved with a predatory efficiency. Within minutes, they were in the back of a reinforced SUV, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the torrential downpour. Outside, the world was a blur of gray and neon, but inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of rain and Kendra's labored breathing. She was a nurse. She knew the mechanics of what was happening, but the reality of labor brought a vulnerability that no amount of clinical training could mask. As a particularly violent contraction doubled her over, Marcus did something he had never done. He reached out and let her hand crush his own. He realized that for all his power, he could not command the pain to stop. He could only offer a tether. To keep her anchored, the man of silence began to speak. My grandfather used to say the Han River was the pulse of soul, Marcus started, his voice a low, melodic baritone that cut through the thunder. He was a dockworker who built a life out of nothing but iron and grit. He told me that when the great storms came, the river didn't fight the rain, it absorbed it. It grew stronger. He spoke of a lineage Kendra had never heard of the gene ancestors who had survived wars and famine by prioritizing the bloodline above the individual. He described the cold winters in Busan and the warmth of a family kitchen he hadn't stepped into for 20 years. He painted a picture of a heritage rooted in survival, narrating the long, arduous journey of his family from the docks of South Korea to the skyscrapers of New York. You aren't just carrying a child, Kendra, he whispered as the hospital lights finally appeared through the gloom. You are carrying the resilience of everyone who came before me. This boy is the river. He will absorb the storm. By the time the wheels hit the hospital bay, the nurse had found her focus, calmed not by medicine, but by the weight of the history he had placed in her hands. The sterile, white-tiled walls of the delivery suite felt worlds away from the obsidian towers of the gene group, but the air within them was charged with a far more primal tension. For Marcus, the hours had passed in a strange, suspended animation, his senses heightened by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and Kendra's controlled, focused breathing. When the room finally erupted into a flurry of medical motion and the first, sharp cry of a newborn pierced the quiet, the untouchable king felt a sudden, violent shift in the tectonic plates of his own soul. It's a boy, the doctor announced, moving with practiced efficiency to clear the infant's lungs. Minutes later, after Kendra had been stabilized and the room had settled into a heavy, sacred peace, Marcus was invited to approach. His hands, which had signed off on the dismantling of rival companies without a tremor, shook as he took the small, bundled weight from a nurse. He looked down into the face of Elijah, a child who shared the slant of his eyes and the stubborn set of his jaw. In that singular moment, the rigid armor Marcus had worn for 40 years didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The cold, calculated empire builder died in that chair, replaced by a man who realized that every ledger, every shipping lane, and every billion-dollar merger was a hollow trophy compared to the pulse beneath the swaddling clothes. He didn't speak for a long time, his thumb tracing the impossibly small curve of the infant's cheek. He was no longer a man without a future, he was a man with everything to lose. The realization didn't make him feel weak, it made him feel lethal. When Victor Lang appeared at the door of the suite, his tablet ready for a status report on the Halston coup, Marcus didn't even look up. His gaze remained fixed on his son. Victor, Marcus said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm whisper that made the lawyer pause. I'm done with the surgical approach. Dr. Adrian Wolf violated the sanctity of life for his data points. He stole the one thing I thought I'd never have and used it as a weapon against a woman who deserved none of this. Marcus finally looked at Victor, and the lawyer saw a fire in his boss's eyes that surpassed any corporate rivalry. It was the absolute resolve of a father. I want you to burn every bridge. Liquidate the Wolf Institute's offshore holdings. Leak the archival breaches to every major medical journal. Use the syndicate contacts to ensure he has nowhere to hide, legally or otherwise. I don't want a settlement, Victor. I want him erased. As Elijah let out a soft, contented sigh in his arms, Marcus turned back to Kendra, a silent promise passing between them. The war wasn't just about truth anymore, it was about the world his son would inherit, and Marcus Jean was prepared to burn the old world down to secure it. While the sacred quiet of the recovery wing provided a temporary reprieve, the birth of Elijah had only sharpened the urgency of their mission. For Kendra, the transition from patient back to professional was fueled by a cold, maternal fury. 2 days after the delivery, she sat propped up in the high-security suite Marcus had secured within the hospital, her laptop glowing against the dim light of the room. Marcus stood by the window, a silent sentinel, watching the shadows of the city while Kendra dove back into the digital labyrinth of the Wolf Institute. She didn't look for the public records or the official patient portals Marcus's investigators had already scrubbed. Instead, she utilized the backdoor protocols common in neonatal nursing, the redundant, encrypted storage systems used for tracking experimental medication dosages and off-book lab results. Her fingers moved with a clinical precision, bypass coding through layers of medical security that were designed to keep out lawyers, but not the nurses who actually ran the floor. Wolf was always obsessive about data integrity, Kendra whispered, her eyes reflecting the scrolling lines of code. He wouldn't just delete his successes. He would have a shadow ledger, legacy log, to track his variables. After an hour of rhythmic typing, the screen flickered and settled on a series of hidden directories labeled Project Primus. As Kendra began to decrypt the files, the sheer scale of the atrocity began to unfurl. It wasn't just a single unauthorized procedure or a unique obsession with Marcus's lineage. The ledger contained a meticulously organized list of hundreds of entries. Each one detailed a legacy sample. Taken from high-profile, often powerful men under the guise of fertility preservation, and cross-referenced them with unsuspecting women who had sought routine medical care. Marcus moved to the bedside, his eyes narrowing as he read the names. It was a directory of the city's elite, their biological futures harvested and redistributed without their knowledge. He wasn't just playing God, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly tone. He was building a silent network of illegitimate power. Kendra scrolled further, her breath hitching as she saw the status updates. There were dozens of other Elijahs, children born into families who had no idea their biological history had been doctored in a lab. Wolf had used these women as vessels for his grand experiment, creating a generation of legacy heirs who could be used as leverage against the most powerful men in the country. The human element Kendra had brought into Marcus's world was just one piece of a vast, sociopathic mosaic. They weren't just fighting for their own truth anymore, they were holding the evidence of a crime that had systematically violated the lives of dozens of families. "We aren't just taking down a doctor," Kendra said, looking up at Marcus with a resolve that matched his own. "We're exposing a factory." The trap was not a physical cage, but a sophisticated financial and legal strangulation that Marcus Jean executed with the cold precision of a grandmaster. Within 48 hours of uncovering the nursing files, Dr. Adrian Wolf found his world collapsing in a series of synchronized strikes. His research grants were frozen by the Department of Justice, his private offshore accounts were drained through a series of untraceable cyber attacks coordinated by Victor Lang specialists, and the Wolf Institute was surrounded by federal agents acting on the detailed, forensic roadmap Kendra had provided. Kendra sat beside Marcus in the back of the darkened SUV as they watched the live feed of the chaos unfolding at the clinic. She felt no triumph, only a grim, professional satisfaction. "He's trying to scrub the local servers," she noted, pointing to the erratic data spikes on her monitor. "But he's too late. The legacy log is already in the hands of the Attorney General." Wolf, realizing the institutional walls were closing in, attempted to flee through a secondary service exit, clutching a briefcase containing the last of his hard drive backups. He didn't make it to his waiting sedan. Instead, he was intercepted by 3 men in charcoal suits who moved with a silent, synchronized lethality that owed nothing to government training. They didn't read him his rights, they simply guided him into the back of a blacked-out van that bore no markings of the state. An hour later, Marcus walked into a derelict warehouse on the edge of the shipping docks, the scent of salt air and industrial grease heavy in the darkness. Wolf was zip-tied to a chair beneath a single, flickering bulb, his clinical arrogance replaced by the frantic, wide-eyed terror of a man who realized he was no longer a player in a civil courtroom. "You have a brilliant mind, Adrian," Marcus said, stepping into the light, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. "You spent years treating human lives like data points. You treated my lineage like a commodity. You treated Kendra like a lab animal. It was for the advancement of the species, Marcus." Wolf stammered, his voice cracking. "The genetic potential alone." Marcus slammed a heavy, medical-grade folder onto the table in front of the doctor. "I don't care about your theories. You violated the one thing that was mine, and you endangered the woman who gave my son life. Marcus leaned down, his eyes reflecting a darkness that the boardroom had never seen. The federal government wants you for fraud. My colleagues in the shipping syndicate want you for what you did to their families' legacies. They don't believe in long-term incarceration. They believe in the kind of justice that ensures you never look at a microscope again. Marcus turned to the men standing in the shadows and gave a single, sharp nod. He walked out of the warehouse without looking back, the sound of wolves begging fading behind the heavy steel doors. The untouchable king had found his son, and for those who had threatened that miracle, the world had just become a very small, very dark place. The silence that followed the clinical dismantling of Dr. Wolf was short-lived, as the rot within the Gene Group's own board began to fester. Richard Halston, backed into a corner by Marcus's resurgence, decided to set the world on fire rather than lose his seat. By dawn, whispers began to circulate through the financial tabloids. A carefully curated leak detailing an illicit affair, a secret child, and a CEO who had allegedly used corporate resources to hide a scandalous lapse in judgment. Halston was betting that the public would see a predator where there was only a protector. But Marcus Gene had spent a lifetime anticipating the moves of lesser men. He didn't retreat into the shadows of his penthouse, instead, he stepped directly into the glare of the lights. The grand ballroom of the Gene Group headquarters was packed with a cynical press corps when Marcus walked onto the stage. He wasn't alone. Kendra stood beside him, her presence regal and steady, and in her arms, Elijah slept, oblivious to the cameras that could destroy his future before it began. It was a visual that Halston hadn't accounted for, that the scandalous mistress was a woman of undeniable strength, and the illegitimate heir was a living miracle. For years, you have known me as a man of cold logic and calculated moves, Marcus began, his voice carrying an emotional resonance that hushed the room. And you have heard rumors this morning of a scandal. But the only scandal here is the violation of human life by a man who thought himself above the law. The woman beside me is not a headline, she is a survivor of a medical conspiracy that attempted to treat our biological history as a commodity. He didn't shy away from the truth. He laid out the reality of Wolf's legacy initiative, turning the narrative of an affair into a story of profound resilience. He spoke of the impossible truth, the 99.9% DNA match that had initially shattered his world but had ultimately given him a purpose far greater than any board seat. By the time he introduced his son, the room had shifted from predatory curiosity to stunned silence. This is not a lapse in judgment, Marcus concluded, his hand resting protectively on Kendra's shoulder. This is a miracle that was stolen and then found. If my fitness to lead is questioned because I choose to protect my family and expose a criminal enterprise, then the board is welcome to my resignation. But know this, I am no longer just building a company. I am building a legacy that my son will be proud to carry. The flashbulbs erupted, but the mood had changed. The story wasn't about a disgraced CEO, it was about a king who had finally found his heart. In the back of the room, Richard Halston watched his career dissolve in the warmth of that collective empathy, realizing too late that Marcus Gene was never more dangerous than when he had something worth fighting for. The dust from the public exposure had barely settled when the final pieces of the old regime crumbled. Dar. Adrian Wolf's specialized cell at the state penitentiary was a far cry from his sterile genomic lab, and Richard Halston's forced resignation had been finalized with a cold, ironclad settlement that barred him from the industry for life. The Gene Group stock had not only stabilized but surged, buoyed by a public captivated by the narrative of a man who had chosen blood over boardroom optics. Yet, for Marcus, the silence of the penthouse no longer felt like a vacuum of power. It felt like a beginning. He found Kendra in the nursery, a room once designed for sterile architectural perfection that was now cluttered with the chaotic, vibrant reality of a growing child. Elijah was asleep in his crib, a tiny anchor of peace in the center of their reconstructed world. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, watching Kendra organize a stack of medical journals. Her mind already moving toward the non-profit foundation they were building to support the other families Wolf had exploited. The board approved the restructuring this morning, Marcus said, his voice shedding the jagged edges of the last few months. We're launching the Legacy Transparency Initiative. It will be entirely independent of the Gene Group's commercial interests. Kendra looked up, her expression guarded but expectant. And my role? A full partnership, Marcus replied, stepping into the warmth of the room. Not just as a figurehead, but as the director of the foundation. You have the clinical insight I lack, and more importantly, you have the trust of the victims. He paused, the gravity of the next words making his chest tighten in a way that no billion-dollar merger ever could. But I'm not just asking for a professional alliance, Kendra. This house, it was built to keep the world out. I want it to be a place where we actually live. I want you and Elijah to stay. Not for security, but because I don't know how to be a father, or a man, without you here to remind me what's real. Kendra stood, smoothing her silk blouse as she walked toward him. She didn't reach for him immediately, she needed the space to define herself. I won't be a trophy, Marcus. I won't be a footnote in the Gene dynasty. My work, my autonomy, those are non-negotiable. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said, and for the first time, the smile that reached his eyes was genuine. The untouchable king is an old story. I think I'd prefer to be a man who simply comes home. Kendra finally bridged the distance, resting her head against his chest. The fortress of glass and steel finally felt like a home, held together not by secrets or DNA percentages, but by the deliberate choice to build a new empire on the foundation of the truth. Thank you for listening, kindly subscribe to my channel for more interesting stories.